Bueno, buenos dias to everybody. I'm glad everybody could show up, and all of you that are out there in Streamland. I am Cherríe Moraga, and I am here with Celia Rodríguez and, of course, Yolanda Lopez. Celia and I are now the co-directors of Las Maestras Center for Chicana, Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. And it is our long wish to be able to bring Yolanda Lopez to this campus and also to this idea, to this world of thinking of ourselves as Las Maestras in the sense of being teacher, but also Las Maestras in the sense of maestra artist. And if there's anybody, you know, as Chicanas, that we can say for sure that is indeed our master teacher, it would be Yolanda. And so we're very excited to have her, and especially I feel we're especially lucky, Celia, because we had her the day before too, you know, we'll get her the day after, and just to be able to have so many conversations with her. So in this very short amount of time that we have, what I'd like to do is kind of just begin by giving a little bit of background on Yolanda. Some people may know her work, you know, inside and out, and have been following, as we have, since we were much younger, all of us, of her, I'm not going to say career, I'm going to say her life practice. But some of you may be brand new to this, particularly those of you that are coming in, you know, as young students now. So I want to say a little bit about, just kind of run a little bit of the chronology, you know, of what you've been up to. And then Celia and I will be asking you questions, and, you know, feel free to talk as much as you want, and we'll cut you off when we're watching the time, right? Okay. So pretty much, you know, what Yolanda has talked about in many places is that her origin story, or her familia origin story, is a little bit different, you know, than what people often imagine, you know, that whoever Mexican Americans, Mexicans, United States are. But it's not really that little bit different. It's just that usually there's only told one story about us. And so her story, actually, I have a lot of, resonates very much with my own family story. But her parents came after the revolution, and they did not come to California, they did not come to Texas, they came first to New York City. And there are images of your family that are phenomenal, you know, like just the clothes and the, you know, like high styling, you know, and it's not like they were rich people, but they were people that got themselves there and were making livings there, and then eventually came to San Diego. And this is where Yolanda's story begins. And basically talking about, there's much to talk about in terms of your life in the, you know, growing up in the 50s as you described, which is very different than us, just a little bit behind you growing up in the 60s. But that mentality of the 50s is something that we also want to talk about for her to do the work, the highly, you know, third world feminist identified work that she did and continues to do. For her to come out of the 50s and do that, that's something. And one of the major things, though, is her time that she spent she went in the late 60s, she came up to San Francisco State University. At that time it was called San Francisco State, right? Just like, and really describes that period of time when she goes there. This was also the beginning of the Third World Liberation Front movement, the movement for ethnic studies, all of that. And this is her moment of conciencia, of really coming to political consciousness. From that period of time, too, is where some of you may know this, where she also became involved with the movement for Los Siete to free a group of young men, mostly Central American men, who had been accused of murdering a policeman unjustly. They were accused, and a whole movement sprang out of that. She was very involved in that, involved in a publication called Basta Ya. And the most interesting thing, which we'll talk more about, is a lot of the images that come out of that period that she did for that magazine were in fact never signed by Yolanda. And to me, in many ways, that is the measure of what it is for her to be an artist that always saw it as a we and not an I, you know? And so moving on to there, she does eventually return to San Diego to get her MFA. And during that time, some of the images that she's the most known for, the Guadalupe series, Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim, that image, all of those things that are coming out of that time, the Tres Mujeres, the Guadalupe versions, the ones of where you see, many of them are autorretratos, self-portraits. That whole period of time, again, those were coming out of that, coming out of the MFA period, right? And the people that she worked with there, her own teachers there. She comes back to the Bay Area in 1980s, as she put it, because she wanted to have a child, which I think is really she wanted to have a child, right? A very independent, so ahead. That's what I like. Just such a forerunner in that sense, and stayed, of course, politically involved, and her feminism grew also at that time. Some of the work that women's work has never done is a series of her identification with the labor movement. Working class women has always been her point of reference. And going into the 90s, something that has preoccupied her from the beginning, I think, since living so close to Tijuana, which I can also identify with when going there in the 60s, the commodification of what it is to be a Mexican, the images, the iconography, all of this stuff, her critique of that, and its relationship to, appropriation, also appropriation, the danger in that. And into installation work that she was doing also in those later years in the Bay Area, and bringing us up to today. So that was like a very, very fast run. But I think what I wanted, partly, for those of you that don't know Celia and me, I'm a writer and Celia's a visual artist. We have our own long histories. But it was really important to have Celia come and talk here with Yolanda, because they are both visual artists, and they have certain ideas too about the why of the work. Both of them are very politically motivated, but their styles are completely different, and their understanding of also, they both refer to themselves as conceptual artists, and so that's where I thought maybe you might want to begin.
Thank you, Cherríe.
Sure.
Well, I think I want to start by saying that at the time that Yolanda was working in the Bay Area, I was living and grew up in Sacramento, California. And really was politicized in Sacramento, but the intellectual, the conceptual aspect of the political work was in the Bay Area around the Brigada Venceremos, which took me into working in the Bay Area for, in preparation for a 2-month-long work trip into Cuba in 1971. I was very young, and I was able to meet the folks from Oakland, San Francisco, and I was completely captured in terms of imagination, in terms of the culture and the political awareness of the era. So many of us young people that folks who were in their late 20s and 30s were our elders. These were people we looked up to in their work. So I, at that moment, thought of myself as wanting to be an artist, but did not see myself as an artist. Instead, I saw myself, basically joining the movement and becoming an activist and taking the time to understand that. So Yolanda's work was a beacon. It was one of the few women's works that were done at the time. So very visible in Basta Ya, which I used to read. And so I think what I was interested in was, when we say conceptual, we have this understanding from Western art canon about what that means. But when I speak to you, you have another perspective.
It's just a different language. So that what sort of clarified for me in working with Alan Sekula and Martha Rossler was that, which I think many of us had been doing, was developing content. What is it that you actually see within, like say, a piece of paper, a canvas, or an installation? What is it? What is the content? What is it about? But also that content that an artist makes exists in a context, which is can be anything from a political environment to a social environment. Whether you're a political environment, whether you're Reagan is your governor, or Trump is your governor, or you're a president, or whether you have your working class, and your mother is working, as my mother did, in a laundry in a hotel at one point, where she's a presser and she's standing up, where you stand up and you go, psh, those steam things, and your grandmother and grandfather, so that but also all the things that happen at one time. is the context in which your art functions. And you know, can I just sort of quickly go ahead, because one of the things that I've kind of recently became aware of is that the Guadalupe pieces, which I did in 1978, was all, you know, pure research. Nobody was talking about Guadalupe at that time except as a sacred Roman Catholic icon and a Mexican icon, because there were other Catholic churches who were not Mexican American in San Diego and had no idea what the Virgin of Guadalupe was. They saw her simply, as we all know, as the Virgin Mary. And so at the time when I did that, looking at it from the vantage point of the burgeoning second wave of feminism, and looking at how, one of the things that interested me was there was a lot of discussion and books put out about body language, about the looking at advertisements and how that influenced our values, you know, whether you're going to wear deodorant, you know, you don't want to stink. And even though you don't stink, you know, it's still like selling you an item that you need to go out and spend $3 or $4 on. But so at that time when I did the Guadalupes, it was highly offensive. Everybody within the certain realm of I would say Latino to many people. The discourse that was going on with feminism, you know, what are you doing hiking up her dress? What are you doing putting her at a sewing machine like my mother? And what are you doing with her as an old woman? Because we don't see the Guadalupe as an old woman. And so that was very strong. In fact, when I first showed the work, I had to. I was told that I had to have bodyguards. So the first showing of the work, I had, and this was from the Centro Cultural de la Raza, who actually I was working with on. They helping me with the reception and actually having people come to the university for the exhibition, which I felt was sort of integrated the school at the time. Since I was the only graduate student in the visual arts department that was a person of color, period, including faculty. But now looking at the Virgin of Guadalupe, it's seen as a sort of a feminist forerunner, and it's, you know, it's not as, it's still controversial because it was recently shown a few years ago at the LA County Museum. It's called On the Road to Aztlan, something like that. And I just had one piece, and sure enough, the Guadalupanos who came from a local church and picketed every, you know, they went to mass and then they came and picketed the museum, which for me personally, I said, God, I guess it still has its power.
Really?
But the context was quite different. So now that has been written about within scholarly terms, it's seen now as a feminist icon. Where at the original point, you know, I was going to hell, and there are people who still think I will go to hell indeed. But it's the context of how it is seen is quite different than it was then. So I just wanted to talk about, when we talk about conceptual art, that's probably the best example I have of saying how the content is más o menos the same, but the context changes, and the interpretation of that is something that, as an artist, you know, who knew, you know, who knew what today would be, you know, and who knows what it will be seen in the near future, you know. So
well, talking about what it reminds me of is also the Pilgrim piece, right?
Yeah.
Because the context for that, unfortunately, is all the same and very different too.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Because I did the what I call the Guadalupe series, and I did the Illegal Alien all at the same time, that August of whatever it was, 1978. The thing is, for the Guadalupe series, I did that as part of my MFA presentation, because I had to have a show, and I had to have a catalog, and I had to have an oral interrogation, essentially, about what I was doing. But I did not. But I did not show the Who's the Illegal Alien, because I knew, because I was already like on the brink not being able to graduate. And so if I showed the Who's the Illegal Alien there in San Diego, I for sure would not have graduated at all. But at the same time that I was going to graduate school, I was working with Herman Baca's the Committee on Chicano Rights, which was probably the most vocal talking about the border and the abuse of the Border Patrol. And also at the same time there was KKK was visible. David Duke, I knew David, we all knew David Duke in San Diego. And there was something called the Minutemen, which was more of a civilian type thing, but also very conservative, who did demonstrations on the border where they would go park the cars and turn on the lights at night so that anybody crossing the border would be exposed. But also the end of the Vietnam War, which was 1975, because one of the things that war does is it accelerates the technology. So since we were not fighting a conventional war in Vietnam, that there was a way of looking at what we call the Viet Cong. I don't like that word, but nonetheless, that's the parlance of night vision, because all of a sudden we developed it. We could see binoculars where our soldiers could look at night. There was also like heat sensors. So whether it was a deer or a human crossing within a certain radius, they could tell, what the shape. It was like a, rating whatever heat they had at the time, and also movement centers, which would be implanted in, in whatever parameters there were for the Army, but also within that technology coming to. La Frontera and between San Diego and Tijuana were the motion detectors, so that so anybody crossing anywhere along that line or going along parallel to the fence, as it were, would be detected. So all that technology, and there's more, like the development of the helicopter, especially in San Diego, which had once World War II ended, and the airline manufacturing industry sort of, pretty much disappeared. But in what happened in Vietnam was the development of the helicopter as an assault weapon. Because before in the past, helicopters had been used as medivacs and supplies and things like that. But once in Vietnam that it was used as an assault weapon, it went immediately to the border. So we saw a lot of images at the time of helicopters with these high intensive beams going across the border. It was pretty scary. And also, you have to remember, the first time that a helicopter was used in civilian was in Berkeley, at the part of the Third World Strike. So, and where they were dropping like canisters of
tear gas.
Gracias. So that all that came. I'm talking about it, as far as like us within the student movement, but also all that technology came to the border. So that, and in part, that was part of why I wanted to do, in working with Herman Baca and the Committee on Chicano Rights, wanted to do, because they had very little or no visuals. I mean, these are all like guys, so what I found within that, especially within the feminist thought, was it also applied to the Guadalupe and the illegal alien, was that one of the things I think is so attractive about the running Guadalupe in particular is that she has expression. There's joy, there's exuberance, and within the movement, as far as even like within the larger anti-war movement and all that, there was no real joy, going on. It always, like, the idea of fighting the revolution was fierce, yes, but like, what is it? Emma Goldman said, "You're not going to have dancing at the revolution. I don't want to be there," But it's the idea. But I think that's one of the things that was, to me, kind of new at the time. It was that the idea was there was you could be working in the movement, but also I felt that with the illegal alien, it's a gift to me. A lot of, because I found that with it, a lot of men. Women as well, but a lot of men really react very strongly to who's the illegal alien pilgrim, because it is a man who's got sort of a Aztec, indigenous garb, and but he's got an expression, because a lot of times, even with our imagery and the whole pantheon of our heroes, whether it was Cesar Chavez or Emilio Zapata or Pancho Villa or it goes on, but and it's always like about 6 men, that, especially in Chicano Park, developing at that time. It was always like these men, this lineup of the pantheon of our heroes, but they were all very stoic looking, without expression. And here I wanted to portray, I felt like a feminist gift giving to movement men an expression, anger, self-righteousness. But not only that, but what does he have in his hand? You know, he has a sheaf of papers talking about immigration plans. So it's not like a big, AK-47, or even like with Zapata's, these big sort of ancient wooden rifles and guns. But this is a man that our gift as feminists, who is talking about ideas. So that the weaponry is not necessarily our guns, but the weaponry is, we have a thinking population. And that, I think, is part of what's appealing to men. That they are presented not only with a self-expression as fierce, as fearsome and self-possessed, but also with the kind of, this is what needs to be done, rather than a big AK-47 or, a Glock would have been nice, but that's not, that's something else. But anyhow, but you understand the difference, and that's where I think feminism comes into that imaging of the illegal alien. That it's a thinking man, just like the woman running as Guadalupe. She's got the cloak pulled back from her. She's got it clinging onto there, and she's moving, and it's moving her dress, and she's got her her shirt sleeves rolled up, and she's going for it, So that to me is sort of like they're both self-possessed and have an inner, when you look at them, there's a kind of an inner life to them. And I think that's a real gift of feminism at the time, especially looking at the representation of women in particular. And so that transferring it over to how men are portrayed as well.
Well, also that particular piece too, when you were taking that, about context, right?
Yeah.
And that's one piece that I was going to say, like, for better, unfortunately, that piece keeps reverberating in meaning, right? Because up to this day in time, the relationship about immigration is just, it's horrific. It's worse than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And so it just is, I just like there was a place about vision in it, that those two things hold up. And also that it is because you're also, planting into there an indigenous perspective. That is the man you're portraying, right? And when you see with young people now in their own, movement in terms of, really a growing movement of people looking at themselves again in terms of their own indigenous identities, and, it resonates still, so I think that's quite interesting.
But the whole idea, if I can speak about indigeneity, is that there's a wonderful exhibit that just passed at the San Francisco Arts Commission. And it is about indigeneity, and but it's interesting in the sense because it expands the idea of what it means. There's 3 major artists that appeared in that. One was Helea Sinzinjani, who is Dene, Navajo, and another one is a man, and I think his last name is Adams, who is Algonquin, and Algonquin were the East Coast indigenous folk. And the third person was Janine Messeline, who is Samoan. And the idea of, when we think about manifest destiny, is the idea, because that's really an ugly, and what's what I call a pornographic document, and because it poses a relationship to not only colonialism and Western European thought, but also to the land. Because Manifest Destiny talks about Mother Earth and the conquering, the possession of somehow the Western European colonizers had to go all the way across the continent. But they didn't stop there. They continued on to Samoa, the Pacific Islands.
Right.
They went as far as like the Philippines. We owned the Philippines, you know, for a while, and they even changed their language to the main as English, you know, at one point. So that the idea of what is an indigenous population within that exhibit not only went like between like the northern plains Indians, which we're quite used to, but also all the way down to the southern tip of South America. So that the idea of indigenous is, what was beautiful about the show was that it no competition, you know, but the idea of we are here. And, you know, again, it's like what Jose Mateo, aquí estamos y no nos vamos. We're not going anywhere. We're right here. We're not dead. You know, we haven't disappeared. You know, our indigenous culture, in fact, in many ways is still embedded within what we call American culture. So I keep thinking about Africans and the slaves, you know, which is so infused in what we call American culture, whether it's American music. I mean, it's right there, you know. It is derived from that heritage that we have I say we, but it's also like within our, as far as indigenous culture, it's also like in our food. You know, I had a class where I actually had the students perform a banquet, and I said, only indigenous food. What did they find? Tomatoes, potatoes, pumpkins, and, you know, all turkeys, you know. I mean, there's this whole glorious part of our cuisine that is very much part of the Americas, you know. And we celebrate it, but Thanksgiving, but it's, you know, I saw a book once called on Italian cooking. It says before the discovery of Columbus, because when you start looking at what is Italian food, you know, what are they going to do without tomatoes? Anyhow, but I forgot what the question was.
That's right.
No,
No,
but I wanted to just pick up on the illegal alien.
Oh, okay.
The idea then of questioning the standard notion of who is an alien.
Yes.
And I think that aspect of it then brings back again something that is, you know, commonly forgotten when we look at immigration policy. I mean, that it is a policy that affects the continent in a way that isn't always discussed. So that when you have the whole image of having a Mexica, you know, represent and question who's the illegal alien pilgrim, you know, I think really captures then, you know, sort of goes beyond the nation state notion, which, because we're always talking about the nation states, Nicaragua, Salvador right now, you know, but Mexico, Guatemala, you know, over and over we're presented with these nation states sort of moving towards the border. And what's always hidden is, one, our relationship politically to those countries. I mean, what did the U.S. in policy do to create these inequities in which people had to leave to survive? You know, and I think that image then brings us back again to looking at these people as continental indigenous people. I mean, often in the U.S., when we think indigenous people, the idea of the South remains in the South. In other words, you can be indigenous as long as you stay in your nation in the South. But once you're on the road, and once you've hit the U.S., then somehow that idea of indigeneity is occulted, and you become, maybe you're pushed to become part of the Latino presence, you know, and maybe hitting even under being Mexican, right? Because when we look at things Mexican, actually we can filter out that there's so many other populations here, Nicaraguenses, Salvadoreños, as we were talking earlier, that have been here for, you know, many, many years beyond this moment historically. So I think that image kind of reflects that. But then going back to the Guadalupe, for me, the most important aspect of that, and I say it this way, is that you stepped out of line. In other words, to take that image on that was so static and sacred, you had to misbehave. You know, I mean,
Yes.
that, I mean, it's kind of like saying, okay, you know, the and then moving on because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's true.
This was taking a big step, and
That's
for
absolutely true.
all of us, you know, who were trying to say, we too need to move forward. That's what that looked like. Being able to then say, okay, so yes, I want to be a good girl, but I can't be a good girl and step out of line. You know, and I think that's the tooth for me. The connection between is bringing connection again, and that, you know, that idea into visibility, into presence.
Yeah, got it. No, I think you're right. And I had there were certain advantages, even though I was raised, I went to catechism, so I was raised a Catholic. But my home, where I lived with my grandparents and my mother, was pretty secular. We didn't go to Mass or any of that. In fact, at some point when I was going to catechism, I sort of corralled my sisters to go up the street and go to a Mass at once. I think I did it once or twice. That was it. But so there was an advantage in that sense for me. But I knew that it was risky. And the reason how can I say, I settled upon the Guadalupe is because I was looking for images of what we did as part of the movement. What kind of images did we, you know, as a feminist myself, you know, trying to find out how we portrayed ourselves. Mm-hmm. And especially there was this whole thinking that John Berger, in his idea of looking at advertisements and how advertisements depict aspirations, but also, like, you know, the idea of especially with the Dutch, of showing landscapes and all that. It wasn't just showing cows, but what it was it was commissioned because it showed how much land this person owned, how many cows, or the big fields. So it was a way of exposing the landowner. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution of what I own, you know, and the beginning of capitalism, actually, you know, rather than just sacred figures. Right. So that I was very conscious with the Guadalupe that it was dicey, but not only in the aspect of the broader culture of Mexican Americans and Chicanos and Latinos, and especially there in a very conservative San Diego, was that I realized most of my professors, because this was all for work for my MFA, my professors were not Christian.
That helps.
They were totally blind to the fact that I realized that I had to go in and tell them, this is a Christian image, this is a Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, and this is the Mexican version of the Virgin Mary. And I was able to talk about luck. I realized that I needed somebody on my committee who was familiar with it, and I found this woman, and I forgot her, Solis, her last name, and I can't remember right now her first name, but she came out of the medical field, and she had done research. Her name was Dr. Solis. She had come out of doing research on pesticides in the fields. Okay. So I said, oh my God. She came to and I had like a 10-minute conversation. Oh yeah, okay, I'll be there. She showed up a little bit late, and I was like sweating bullets trying to explain this to my 6 people who were part of my orals. And so she came in, and she immediately read it, and she immediately took over the discussion. So that's the only reason that I survived graduate, because there was a question about whether, because they had no understanding about what I was doing and putting it within the context of what we were talking about there as conceptual art. Yes. You know, but putting it in a different sort of ethnic, sort of cultural, you know, historical field, which they had. These are all New York people who had New York agents, you know. And anyhow, so it was dicey for me. The Guadalupe was dicey for me in that sense as well, you know. So I was, it was touch and go all the way through, And of course, you know, I was relegated to fry in hell for sure. I know.
We'll all be there with you. Hopefully. So hopefully, right? Good company. One of the things that I want to kind of go back, like a 10-year flip back, right, to that. So that was around 1978. Is that right? When you were doing MFA, yes. We go back to '68. We go back in. So now you're up there at San Francisco State, and you're
Yeah.
in the mission, all this activism is going around, right? So one of the things that you and I had talked about this yesterday at the dinner table, and I said, oh, well, I said, when you're talking about third world liberation and the third world women's movement, and this is what, even before this bridge called my back, we had, our debate was, well, were we going to say radical women of color, we're going to say women of color, we're going to say third world women, and because this is what we came up with in the 70s as internally colonized, you know, people of color in the United States, and then we were feminists, so it's like third world feminists, like that. So then I said to you, well, you know, I think you invented, said, it didn't come with intersectionality, did not come with, you know, academia, right? That in fact, what fundamentally you were doing, what we were doing, what you even, and I consider you a predecessor for Bridge, you know. It took us a while to get all the images in the book, as it should be. You know, you should be in there, the visual language of that liberation. But I want you to talk a little bit about that, like what was, you know, and you also had mentioned how important the Vietnamese women's movement, so if you could talk about that little point in history.
In working with Los Siete, one of the
Los
wonderful
Siete,
things was that, which is, you know, a defense committee again for these 7 young men who are accused of killing this brutal undercover cop with his buddy. Came out in a pickup truck, and they saw these young guys out on the sidewalk with a TV set, you know. So you have to remember, this was like 1969, and all of a sudden, like, TV sets were quite large, and if you see this valuable, valuable large TV set, they must have burglarized something. In fact, it was in front of Jose Rios's house, but geez, let me see, I lost my train of thought.
You're talking about the intersectionality, then the third world struggle, and then Los Siete,
so,
like that.
Yeah, so, but the thing is, in working with Los Siete, most of us who came to work for Los Siete came out of the Third World Strike. And the Third World Strike was the idea that, that there were many cultures and politics and ethnicities within the world, and especially within the development of the state college system and the development of the curricula there, that there was nothing to talk about being a Native American, nothing to talk about, very few, what we would call now Black studies. In fact, the chancellor at the time said, oh, you know, we talk about slavery, but it's like 2 paragraphs in one history book, and then, you know, you move on. So there was no discussion about any of the contributions or the where Black history was what we talk about now, and we're still like beginning to discover things, and beginning to, there's a sort of a cadre of scholarship that's working on it, but also, you know, Latinos, Mexican Americans. There was no history when I was growing up about anything except the missions, and the padres were somehow benefactors. So there was very little history about even working class whites, because a lot of the Third World Strike, which we don't mention a lot, is that there was the history of working class whites, which also understood that there was little or no labor history, what we call labor history, but it's about working people in the Americas and the Industrial Revolution, and of course the whole development of industry, and how just that sort of became predominant, and the important part of when we measure the success of us as a government, it was always within those figures of production, you know, what is it, GNP, gross national product. And so that all that came together in the development of the Third World Strike, and saying, we want this history told us, and don't tell us you have it here and piecemeal here and piecemeal. There was a desire to have it actually as a department, and components of that, and talking about history, and which I mentioned before. I think it has changed the way we talk about American history now, totally. But if it hadn't been for that development in that we would not be talking about change. And I think, just as a side note, Henry Louis Gates, in talking about your your roots now, something about ants. But he's talking, because he mentions, white people in various forms, as well as people of color, and not only black people, Latinos. But he's talking about, and he's taking back this sort of people who know nothing about their history, and that white people are horrified that all of a sudden they have somewhere in their background slave owners, but also the fact that they may have a black ancestor as well. It's all sort of, I think it's really going to be very, the impact of that hasn't reached, but I think it will. But it's in many ways sort of comes out of the third world movement, because his program would not have existed without that thinking about,
Yes.
without that thinking and the resurgence of rethinking about American history. So that those people who were part of the state strike, which I was a part of, and I thought I dropped out of school thinking, and I got all incompletes, all Fs, and I thought I'll never go back to college again. And I wasn't the only one in working with Los Siete. This is the people's work, which later, anyhow.
But you during that time of Los Siete, which was, I mean,
the imagery was
just a great. I mean, so much was going on all around. I mean, the Bay Area was just so rich in terms of political activity, cultural activity,
and visuals.
But you also were speaking about a conference that you went to with Vietnamese women.
Yes, of course.
And I didn't want you. No. I wanted you to talk about that.
In about I can't remember. I think it was 71. I can't remember. There was a conference in Vancouver, Canada, where several busloads from the Bay Area and from all parts of the U.S. went to the conference, and it was about being able to listen to Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian women from that Southeast Asian countries talking about the fact that they were political prisoners. They put in what we call a cage, tiger cages, and tortured. And in fact, so the women came out, and most of them, the common parlance was French. But hearing their stories, and some of them were quite, being tortured is not something that just happens once you recover and it's all that, because they had damaged kidneys, they had damaged muscles, so that it became obvious that there were aftermaths, even though they were there, talking to us, and we were also appreciative. And even sometimes like three translations. There might have been Cambodian, which had to be transferred into Vietnamese, and then from Vietnamese into French, and then into English. So that it was an extraordinary experience. And like I said, it happened, nationwide, as far as women from the feminist movement going to hear these women talk in Vancouver. And many of us went back, and the people that I went with who were part of Los Siete, we went back and actually, we understood feminism, aside because from that point of only being a white woman's movement, and only because even Life magazine talking about it only as bra burning, and these women want to be like men, or don't you women want to have men open the doors for you, but it was it was trivialized in that way, with no understanding about what it meant. And I don't know if we totally understood that either. But we went back and with Los Siete, and we dealt immediately with domestic violence within our own group, the man and the woman. We talked about it. And but were we talking about, as you and I have discussed, that where the personal is political. The reality of the Vancouver a conference with the Vietnamese and Laotian and Cambodian women was that the political is the personal, because you could see it in their entire demeanor, their presentation, and I mean, we were all humbled. I have to tell you, humbled in seeing these women and the effort that it took for them to be there. And it was, we went back, not even re-energized, we went back all of a sudden with our focus of feminism becoming much more clear, and we were able to go back to our male-dominated nonprofit activist organization and had a language for it, which I think I have to go back to this bridge called my back, is that one of the profound things about that book was that it provided a language for us to talk about being a woman, and to talk about being a woman that was not normally talked about, whether it was being queer or being the whole spectrum, class, everything. It just, the whole, and race, it was talking about the whole spectrum, but it provided us a language, at least a beginning language, because before there was no way of talking about this. And that was, to me, quite revolutionary at the time. And in many ways, the Vancouver conference was another step, in providing us women who worked as warriors, who were not the cliche about the Viet Cong, and it was, we were able to go back and present and succeed, as it were, in our alternative political activist organizations. And we did have what we called discussion groups. They were not consciousness raising, no, but it was discussion groups talking about men and women. It did not last long, but it lasted. But the thing is, what had happened was it gave us parlance as men and women in that, in a vocabulary.
So, do you have a question?
No, go ahead.
So this is it. So I think this might be a time that you want to talk specifically, when you're talking about the personal is political, about your own experience at that time with Los Siete.
Okay. Yeah,
I think it's the best time.
I was talking to Cherríe and Celia, because this is something I hadn't talked about, but I see it now as putting it in a different kind of context. I was raped at gunpoint in about 1971 or so in my home. And this young person was brought to my home because thinking that since I worked with Los Siete, we could help him. He was a Panamanian. He was a black Panamanian, and I was told by the person who brought him over that he had difficulty not being accepted by the Latino groups because he was black, and not being accepted by black groups because there was a lot of Panthers and other organizations that were black, because he was actually culturally quite different than he was a Latino, but he was black. So my friend brought him over, but unfortunately, this young man, I have no psychology on this at all, but he ended up raping me and my roommate at the time at gunpoint. We were not, assaulted or hurt physically, except for the rape, which was hurt enough. But at the time, all I could think of was, if you've ever been had like a gun, especially like you're either dead or alive, pointed at you. There's a point of clarification where the only thing that happens at that point is you and the gun and the person who potentially can fire that gun. That's all that exists in the world. There is nothing else. And so with me, and I was able to convince him. I said, well, it's okay, we'll talk about this later, so don't worry about it, because I just wanted him to leave without killing us, or me in particular at that time. He did leave, and then so I was so angry, and because the person that had brought him over was part of one of our allies in Los Siete, that I talked to the organization, and they fully supported me. They knew it wasn't because like what are you wearing and what did you say, or any kind of sort of artifice of enticement. And so there was no question of that, which I was very grateful. And they said, well, what do you want to do? I said, I want him dead. I said, and we were talking at the time about being offed. I said, you can off him. I said, we were talking also at the time about, because J. Edgar Hoover and the Conceptual Pro, I could never quite say that, this whole assault on the Panthers at the time, and obviously with Hampton being in Chicago, being killed right there in his bed, by the FBI, so that there was a talk about having unregistered guns, which means you could use a gun and not have it come back to you as the person who bought it. So there was all that kind of talk going around. And I said, just hand me the gun. You find him, I'll do it. No problem. And what happened at the time was, my roommate and I could not stay in the apartment, so we were, the organization found us a safe house. So we went and stayed there for about 2 weeks until we could come back. But in the meantime, his parole officer called us, and apparently he had 2 priors with that. But she was concerned because I heard that there's somebody, or there are people out there willing to shoot him on sight, And so anyhow, he ended up, and I said, well, I don't know anything about it, but I did. But I said, I don't know anything about it. And so anyhow, he turned himself in to his parole officer. So then I said, well, shoot, what am I going to do? Because I knew the second alternative was to go to court, and that's what I did. Because that was the only recourse I have to get him out of the way. Absolutely. Where he wouldn't hurt anybody else, women in particular. And since he had escalated from other weaponry that he had used to using a gun, just whatever. So I went to court. My roommate found it too traumatizing to do that, but I went there. It was traumatizing for me, but it was not traumatizing in the way that we think of now as women as being victim about rape, and we always say, well, whether it's, well, the scenario. I don't need to explain it to you. But I had no sense of being victimized in that way. I was a victim, yes, but it was not a victim in the sense of being mentally or being as a woman, somehow wearing low-cut dresses or who knows what.
Self-blaming.
None of that. Yeah. None of that. And my organization totally supported me in that. And in fact, I have to mention his name, Jose Delgado, since he's passed on. And because part of what the organization says, well, we'll monitor your house, because I was afraid that he would come back. And sure enough, because we lived on the second floor, I could see one occasion I saw Jose walking down to the end of the street, looking around and coming back, and I was forever grateful that was a promise made and a promise kept. That there is a possibility that we have to talk within our organizations about the relationships of men to women. And this was early. This was 1970, 71, and it was still seen as the women's movement, mostly New York based. But with the Women's Conference in Vancouver, it brought it all back home. And it's a constant struggle. It wasn't, like we had this little episode, and I was grateful for it, but, but it was still like not necessarily all the men became feminists. Well, indeed. But we don't talk about the relationships of women, especially in the movement at that time, about, if I can say, like with the Chicano Park film, which I hope you will see, that there is Jose Montoya sort of yeah, they should be a court martial. But what he was talking about was a cadre of women artists from the RCAF, Royal Chicano Air Force from Sacramento, who had gone down ahead of the men because the RCAF was commissioned to do a couple of murals, but the women folk went down on their own, and sure enough, there's our wonderful
Celia was one of them.
Rodríguez there. And there's a quick little shot, you have to look for her. She's there and she's painting a mural. And Jose Montoya's commentary was that he felt that they should be court-martialed because they went ahead without orders or whatever. But it was the anger of women independently working. And I mean, for goodness sakes, they even had a car and they had supplies and went down and just, let's go do it. We know what we want to do, And that was what year was that?
That was 1975, I believe.
That sounds about right.
Well, Jose made it seem as if we just decided to go ahead, but what actually happened was I was on the way back from the Mexico City First International Women's Conference.
That was 1975.
and I stopped in San
International
Diego
UN Conference of
at
Women.
the park. I was traveling. I stopped in San Diego, and Antonia, I think her name is Mendoza, who was the coordinator for the park, showed me. She says, "Well, you must know the RCAF is coming. You all are coming to do a mural." And I said, "No, I know nothing about it." And so she said, "Yeah, you have 4 walls," and it was news to me. And so she says, "Well, we should take one of these walls for you women. Go home and get a group of women together and come back and paint." So, you know, I was in school then, barely. I'd barely gone back to school like you. I had left to the movement. And I was maybe drawing about this large. You know, I was just maybe 8.5 by 11. That's
Beautiful drawing, beautiful.
that's as big as it got. And so I saw this 40-foot wall. I mean, it's 40-foot span by 40-foot high. And I went, whoa. So I went home to Sacramento and asked all the women who wanted to come. And one of the women snitched to Jose.
Ah.
They went in.
Well, he would have missed you anyhow.
Jose came back to me and said, "Are you really going to do this?" And I said, "Yes, we're going to do this." And he says, "Well, okay." Wasn't happy about it. So he was aware of the fact that we came. But all this to say that in not mentioning our names, he erased us. And in the painting of the mural, the names were also erased. And all documentation of the mural has it named 3 different ways, and all our names misspelled. So it's been that way for a long time, you know, that action then was, and I was court-martialed, actually. I was. But not for that. That was just one of the one of the charges.
Thing.
But anyway, that was.
But
Yeah.
so what I'm trying to say is that there is hope for us, for women working in nonprofit activist organizations. It's still a ways to go, but so there was this early, I think with Los Siete, early discussion and early support of women who were, like myself in particular, who were raped at the time, and support for me going to court and actually helping convict this young man. So there was none of this, oh, I'm going to, should not say this, but anyhow, where I'm going to forgive you. None of that for me. I was just blazing angry. And which is, you don't see that with rape victims, such as it were. So, or even like with the women from the RCAF going down and doing it, you know.
Well, I think too that partly what to me about the story, I mean, I'm thinking about also like Joanne Little at that time
Yes.
too. I mean, all of these
Yes.
movements were women for the first time.
Yes.
They were going after their batterers, you
Yes.
know, and you know, or their rapists, what
Yeah.
have you. And I think that's
And
a
put
part.
in jail for it.
Yes, and they are always they're put under the jail. You know,
Yeah.
not the men, the women.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of our history as feminists. For the young feminists now, they don't know those stories. They don't really know about.
Yeah.
What these young women were doing. I mean, they're same age, you know, 20s, and you know, like, and I think that your story, what really kind of moved me about it, and you just said that last night, and it's not something that you've said often, you know, that you've shared publicly,
Yeah.
and also I do want to say with deep love, if it's okay, I can mention. Well, that you told your son last night for the
yeah.
first time.
For the first time.
For the
yeah.
first time. She told
Last
her
night.
son that story because she wanted to make it public today. And you see, to me, and what did he say to you? Makes me cry. What did he say
Yeah,
to you?
he was crying. He said it hurt his feelings that I hadn't told him sooner or something.
Yes, you see, and that's, but you see, that's the point. The point is that then you're talking about men and women, right?
Yeah.
He's a young man. He has a right to know you suffered in this way,
Yeah.
you know?
It's interesting,
But
I haven't quite processed.
Well, I know, and I'm doing it for you because that's just what I do. But but I'm saying it touched me. All I'm reacting to
Yeah.
is what touched me.
Yeah.
The other part that touched me about your story is that you wanted to kill him.
Oh,
And you said, "Give me the gun. I want to kill him. That's what I want to do
No
right
problem.
now. No problem." And that is also what we need to hear. You know, I mean, not that you're advocating gun violence or anything. All the language. We're not talking about their language. You're talking about genuine courage that's also fueled by anger. You know, like how do we direct our anger in which ways, and the right to have the anger.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So whoever's out there hearing this, listen to this woman. You know, I just feel like that both with your son and also that when you referred to you earlier about this era of warrior women. You know, I mean that's warriorship.
Yeah.
You know, so and it gave you a different sense too about. And you said this earlier, and I think this is still not quite caught on, that in contemporary feminist movement that actually that men need feminism, and not like men going, well, I'm a feminist now. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that really truly realizing, you said this yesterday, that sexism hurts them,
Yes.
that it's made them lesser people, you know. And I'm thinking this is something, you know, I feel like we've known for long, you know what I mean, like that it isn't, and women of color, that's why women of color for the most part were never separatists in our feminism, because our position was, no, we want them to get right, you know, and they're not going to get right without us, you know, and so there was, you know, so you bringing that up again, I'm saying these are not the things that are being taught enough anymore. And how did that perspective get, you know?
Well, the thing is, I've done this set of what I call pocket posters, and so
yes.
it's my work, but also behind each little pocket poster there's a, what I'm trying to do is to change the idea of women as victims, but women talking to men, women, and institutions as equals, which is very, very hard to do. I think most women can talk to each other as equals, but I think it's very hard for women to talk to men as equals. And men still behind in their imprisonment about what does it mean to be a man is behind in their head. They're saying, oh, she's talking to me as an equal, ha 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 ha. She's naive, ha 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 ha. She's stupid, you know. And so the thing is, you know, we have to tell men, we know that when we talk to you as an equal, you think of us that way. And the thing is, because in the past it's always been, well, you teach me how to be a good man, teach me how to treat you right.
Yes.
The thing is, we have to say, you are in prison. If you want to get away from the patriarchal oppression that you are living, because it is a hideous, hard to see shell that is encasing you, then you must do the work. And the work involves with every decision you make, with every conversation you have, with every you know, action that you take. This is you're clearing a path towards your own liberation, and that's what we have to tell men, that your liberation from patriarchy. Because right now they see it as a kind of, well, you know, I can do this and I can do that, and you can't do this, but you know, I'm seen as the more qualified for being the CEO or the person who's running the grocery store. But they have to see that as their own imprisonment, and at this point, and it's not something that we can convince them of, and it's something that we have to skirt around. And what I'm concerned with is protecting patriarchy, and we do it in a lot of ways because we don't have to immediately address it, but we have to recognize it and just talk about it, but let them know that we understand it, and it's not always overt, you know. And men will hopefully catch on. If not, it's going to be a long, hard road, because women are becoming stronger, especially with the Me Too movement. That all of a sudden it's like the sort of thing about women have been sexually harassed, or you know, 4 out of 5. I think it's more like 5 out of 5, but
I think so.
4 out of 5. And the thing is, like, women are saying, oh, this happened to you? Yeah, this is what happened to me. Oh, it happened to you? That all of a sudden there's a bonding of a common experience that women are now developing, and especially around sexuality, whether it's something minor, you know, we consider minor, somebody making a rude remark about the way you're dressed or whatever, or actually going to assaulting you, you know, one way or another, whether it's domestic abuse or workplace harassment, that women, I think, are becoming quite strong. So men aren't going to get away with it very long. I could tell you that right now. It's going to take a while, but it's on that path, you know, and giving warning to whatever men are looking at it now, but it's on its way slowly. You know, the revolution is incremental. And that's one of the things that I learned in working, because I used to belong to the Young Democrats when I was going to the College of Marin. And before that, when my mother was a Democrat in conservative San Diego, instead of voting for Eisenhower, this is, or even before, after that, Nixon, I think in '61 with,
Kennedy.
we were Kennedy, you know, so I dragged my sisters over to the Democratic headquarters and, you know, did, you know, stuffing envelopes, stupid stuff. We were high school students. But so the revolution is incremental. It's not going to happen all of a sudden I become like you know, this powerful analytical thinker, but it is. But we have to be aware. Women can no longer pretend to be stupid. We can no longer pretend that, you know, and that's the only book I'm done.
Okay, so I know that we want to open it up to some questions, but I had one more question to ask you, and then maybe if they're being collected, if
I'll
people
try and be terse. Okay.
I'm not sure where we're at with that, but so someone, Mariela or some, I don't know how we're getting questions, but I do have this one question to ask you, and then we'll see if some are coming in. And if not, we'll have more things to say.
There's paper and
Is
pencil
it?
some places.
If you, there are some. I don't know who. I think we lost somebody. So.
Yeah.
And, okay, muy bien. So you can just bring them to Celia if anybody just wants to pass them, or whoever's close. Maybe Sal, because you're right there, son.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's also
there are
microphone.
Oh, I see. Okay,
they
I
have a
see.
mic, yeah.
Okay. All right, but I'm just gonna ask you a question first. Yes. So one of the things that I was thinking about, and we had talked a little bit about this last night, when I look at also those images, those self-portraits of you as a young woman, and they were so liberatory, you know, and the runner, and they're huge. I mean, these are like really, really big, you know, monuments,
4 by
right?
8
You know,
feet.
4 by 8 feet, and so on a certain level, I guess, and we had talked last night, and you know, you are confronting issues of illness now that you never have had to. You've had you've had a history of some close calls too. I mean, in terms of the health issues.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so it's sort of, but now you're, and so now you're looking at, you know, really, you can speak to that to the degree you want, but also that we had talked about what it is too, that suddenly, you know, when you're looking at, as you said, how you look at your lifespan, and it's shorter now.
Yeah.
And so given the body of it, right?
Yeah.
Like you talked about that liberatory body, and now you have, I need to hear you say this. I say, I'm right behind your sister, right? It's like, how do you look at questions of illness and death and dying in the body that you have now, right?
Well, I'm thankful that I'm a Mexican American, and thankful for the Day of the Dead. Even though I myself am not what I would call a spiritual person, I'm quite secular, but there's quite a difference in our, it might be what I call indigenous memory or genetic memory. Genetic memory, which involves our indigenous past, which is hard to explain. But I think in part that's part of what has been how I've come, and I'm still, because I was, what Cherrie's talking about is I was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer about, I don't know, less than a year ago. And so that it's all, you know, I was saying, this because it's the only way I could physically, my life was like infinite with my hand open, you know, I'm sort of beginning here. And then when I was diagnosed with terminal cancer, we don't know it's anyhow. So all of a sudden it went like that. And then I found out that in part of my, and this I think every cancer patient to some degree or other has to confront it, was the radiation and the chemotherapy. Radiation and chemotherapy are the same. It's just a matter of how it's infused in your body. Chemotherapy means that it goes directly into your bloodstream, and with me it's delivered as little pellets or whatever into your tumors and whatnot. So when I discovered that that X-ray, I was like, the last session I discovered that I was under X-ray because that's how the physician saw what he was doing with his little in these tiny little scissors, because my tumor had grown veins and arteries, was that I was in a 3-hour X-ray, and this is the 4th procedure, but at the same time was CD, what did I say? CD, what's it called? CD,
CAT scan.
CAT scan,
Yeah.
which is more intensive
Right.
radiation at the same time. So I said, oh, so all of a sudden it became a little, because what's going to get me first? Either the cancer is going to get me first, or the
Cure.
radiation is going to, the cure
Yes.
will get. And it's very interesting because I think most cancer patients sort of come to that realization whether the cure is as deadly, if not more deadly, than what they're trying to save you from. So what I'm trying to do right now, and part of that, it's not just that, which is interesting and really important, but also the fact of growing older. And because I also, like in my generation, see men and women dying quite frequently, and whether it's people from Los Angeles or even the Bay Area, Sacramento, it just, they're no longer, it's just it's just the natural progression of generations. But all of a sudden, it's right there, in front of me, and and also growing older, like even preparing for this and now, and I'm looking at myself. I said, how did I become so matronly? What happened to the 26-year-old wearing bell bottoms and war surplus, jacket or whatever, and running around in the 60s and 70s, it's the now I need assistance in moving, and it's quite different than seeing myself as an older woman. And I'm not quite sure how I've adjusted to it, or if I quite have, but it does. I'm in the process of it right now. So,
Yeah, but you had also said something about how it makes you look at what you do between now and then, right?
Yeah,
like your purpose in life, right? Yeah.
Well, part of it has been the acceleration of working with my pocket posters, and talking about women, trying to rethink about we're not victims, that we have to talk about not in self, and talking to the world in general as equals, which is, like I said, hard to do. But also like looking at, stupid stuff like archives. All of a sudden I have archives. I never even thought about that. I have archives, I have photographic stuff that's never been seen. All of a sudden there's an interest. I have to mention that I'm part of the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Artists, having like a small little retrospective on the Guadalupe stuff in October. I think October 21st.
And I mentioned too, your archives is here. Your archives are here at UC Santa Barbara.
Excuse me,
and
Sal.
He's been the main person of creating this, and thank you for your support too for this as well, and the special collections.
Because Sal came over and he said, well, I had nothing organized, and I said, well, there's my teaching material. So he opened a drawer. He brought his own little file box, just started putting it in, and and they were mostly my teaching supplies, because I didn't think I was ever going to teach again for some reason, because nobody was, because in the past I've always been hired pretty much without filling out an employment application. I was just, will you come and teach here? So that's what I did. But so that, and I gave to SEMA in particular precious correspondence from my grandmother and my mother, and my biological father, who I never knew, but who is really now with Ancestry.com. My son has become interested. He said, Ma, because he did it to me, and I said, Ma, you have 28 brothers and sisters.
He was busy.
Oh, he was a predator, and that's one of the letters reveal, and my son has never seen that. So I think in part he felt a little bit dispossessed, because there was nothing on my side of the family, because once I die, it's pretty much, that's over. I have cousins which I no longer, as a little kid, since I was the oldest of my generation, it's, you're the oldest of your generation, and if you don't keep, and especially since I left San Diego, you lose contact with, because you're a high school graduate, you're going to college, and you're no longer dealing with elementary school kids or your cousins,
Do you want to ask the questions? Yeah, we can pass that around to
Ask
people.
me a question.
You've had an amazing journey in life, and so I would like to know, what are your 3 of the greatest lessons you have learned doing this work?
What are the what?
3 greatest lessons you've learned doing this work
As an activist?
as an
Or
activist.
just living?
As an activist.
Well, as I just said, the revolution is incremental. Because initially I thought we would all set up machine guns in the street and it would be, you know, there we is, the people would win. The Vietnam War ended, but didn't end until 1975. And we were, you know, already working well before then. It was, you know, the war went on for something like 15 years, you know, at least. So that, and poor Vietnamese, you know, before that they had the French. But anyhow, that's something else. But the revolution is incremental. And the other thing, it's that with women, culturally and socially, we're tied to our looks, which is very, very difficult. And especially it's difficult if you're a woman like myself and some of the women here who were not tied to, I did not grow up with the dream of a wedding and a white dress or a quinceañera or even birthday parties, which is very hard for some of my friends to understand that, you know, you know, I'm not interested in a birthday party or all the conventional stuff, or going to church, or being acquiescent to men. Because that's what I like about the Chicano Park film, is that there's a part of that, because I do talk a little bit about how it is hard for men to talk to women without what I call the girl-boy thing going on there. It's very hard for men to dispossess themselves of that and to have a woman talk to you as, you know, yeah, you're a person, you know, yeah. Secondarily, I am a woman, you're a man, but, you know, we're not dealing with that, you know, just dealing, you know, straightforward. It's very hard for men, and that's what I like about that film. But those are the things that are hard. It's like the revolution is not going to happen instantly. It happens, but it happens among us all, and especially this year, we're in a crisis year. You know, you all know that. So, you know, there's no fooling around. There is no fooling around. There's no sitting this out, because it's going to affect you. We all have to participate in this. You know, democracy is a participatory event, and there is no sitting this out. And the other thing is that growing old is very interesting. We still have a lot of adjustment to do, and with that, and especially, and the idea of class is also become much more pertinent to me. Because I see like advertisements now, especially since like a lot of us older folk, we watch a lot of late night TV, and there's a lot of these advertisements about, you know, vitamins and mixes and retirement homes. And I see retirement homes, they're quite beautiful. You know, I said, you know, white-haired ladies, you know, white-haired men standing erect and tall and ambulatory, you know, in their jeans and whatever, walking down the, you know, a wooded setting, you know. I'm mostly white and occasionally somebody black, but, you know, I said, you know, what's that? And here I am living on Social Security, which was even, because of my family and my mother, I knew nothing about money. And this was all before ATMs, before the Diner Club, I think, was one of the original.
The Diner Club.
Yeah, it was one of the original credit cards. You know,
totally.
how did that work? You know, I had no idea. Or the APR, looking forward to like how they charge you for the money that you use. And one of my first experiences, like in moving back to San Francisco from San Diego, was the ATM, and my male companion at the time, all of a sudden there was this machine and it just spit out $20 bills, you know. And
it's my son always would say, well, let's just go get some money. Like, I'm going to let's go get it. Go to they just think it was just feeding you the money. Like, this is not Las Vegas, son.
but it's all, especially if you come from a you know, a lower working class. And my parents and my grandmother, we were all extremely smart, extremely talented. We weren't stupid, and we weren't farm workers. We were an urbanized people. My grandparents came from Mexico City and Guadalajara. When we talk about the imagery of my grandparents in New York, and she's dressed like an elegant, sophisticated, you know, quasi-Victorian woman. But so that those are the three things: is learning in class about money, and how difficult it is for people from middle class to understand why those of us like me, I'm whatever 70 something or other, still finding out about money. And it's sort of like at 72, I said, oh, I could have bought a house. You know, it never occurred to me at that time. So I had no kind of discourse or discussion within my mother. Just, you know, she went to work left at 5:30 in the morning to take this long trek to the Naval Training Center. And by the time she got back in the winter, it was still dark. You know, and we were, you know, nothing pathetic. We survived living on, you know, day-old bread, which is you get 5 loaves of bread for $1 and things like that. I mean, we weren't starving, but we had margarine and all that stuff. And, you know, we for a long time had no TV at all. So it's not a matter, and I was very active in school. I was 11th grade class president. You know, I didn't go to the prom because, you know, but it's sort of like, but not feeling sorry. And I, you know, felt good. But it was not until that I'm now, as an older woman past 65, that I suddenly realized that I should have known more about money, but my mother couldn't teach me about it. And there was nobody, since I was the oldest, not only my mother's oldest child, but the oldest of my generation.
Yeah.
So, which is a real, I never learned to dance, you know, because I didn't have cousins to come over and we could learn, you know, how to dance or whatever. So there's certain things that I've learned that are, but class is important. What? My thingy is not working or what?
So we have another question. Okay. Can you say, I'm sorry, could you also say the person, who asked the first, who you are? That's all.
I'm Ryan Flaco Rising.
Okay, thank you. And you?
My name's Lisa. I have a question. I think you mentioned something about being the only person of color during your educational journey in San Diego.
Well, in graduate school.
Oh, in graduate school. Okay. How were you treated in those spaces at that time by your peers and faculty? How did you persevere?
I think.
Oh, excuse me.
I think you need that.
A lot of times when you go through things like that, when you don't realize how hard it is. You just take it minute by minute, day by day. Even like the interview for graduate school, I was told right off the back, we usually don't take local people. And then in fact, down a few paragraphs from that, they said we had somebody who was Mexican American here, and he was doing graffiti, something about graffiti art on canvas, and we had to let him go after the first year. And they said, we can't give you any money. You're the last person that we're interviewing, and we can't give you any money. I said, give me money. He said, we can't give you any kind of scholarship. I mean, it didn't even occur to me. Didn't even know that you could that graduate school would actually help you pay. Didn't know that. And I sort of waved my hand. I said, oh, don't worry about it. You know, that's not your concern. I'll get through it. You know, pay my food, my rent, and all that. Because I had been working for the Chicano Federation. You know, I knew how to work. I said, I'll get through it. And they said, why do you want an MFA? They said, you already are showing, because I was showing in Logan Heights, San Francisco, in Chicano Park. And I said, well, I want to be like you guys. You're employed here
Right on.
at the university, and it's because you have this piece of paper. And I want to be seen. I realized that I want to be seen as a professional artist. And the only way I can be seen as a professional artist is if I have a master's of fine arts. So that's why I said, you got it. Some of them didn't have that, but they had, other degrees. And shortly, they were very hostile to me, openly hostile, but I think that was was sort of like the nature of the tenor of the faculty anyhow from New York, and they're doing us all a big favor. And, you know, I don't know who else they interviewed, but I have suspect it may have been the only person of color, but who knows. So I left thinking, well, I blew it. Because suggesting that they were employees was rather than treasured famous professors at the time, which I knew nothing about. I said, well, that's
you got
it.
jobs.
Within less than a week, I got a letter saying that I had been accepted at the school and that they would give me a San Diego a scholarship for $100 a month and I said, well, bus fare, I guess. But I had no idea how it works. This is there's a certain advantage that middle-class people don't understand, and part of that is the conversation about money. I had no idea only recently found out what escrow meant and what was it, equity, things like that. But only now, you know, and well past me even thinking about it, because I am a renter and all that stuff. But talk to your children, talk to your friends about money and how it works. And that's in part of the extension of how institutions work. Most poor people do not know how institutions work.
That's true. I think that's for you to keep.
Oh, okay.
Are there other questions here in the studio audience? I like that. Okay. They're fighting over the microphone.
So that answered your three.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll try to keep the response a little shorter. So we're also inviting everybody, please, to join us at LMC for lunch with Yolanda. So.
I'm Melinda Gondet. I'm with Santa Barbara City College, and we look at your art. And I wanted to ask you, what are you still working today in light of your illness, and how has that changed your practice?
It's been very difficult because the hard part about having cancer is it has made me very weak. So physically, I am not strong. So I can be up and about for about an hour, maybe 2 hours and a half, and that's really stretching it. But then I have to go lay down for about 3 hours, or if I fall asleep, then it might be 3.5 hours. Part of my frustration is that I don't have the energy to work. So that's why I like the idea of cards. Once we go to lunch, and I'll show you my cards, and if you're an activist, I might even hand you a set. But for me, they're part of the work that I do, and I'm also. There's been a sort of a rediscovery of my photography, because I really was initially trained in graduate school as a photographer, and I had a wonderful teacher who, he was not even my teacher, he was somebody I met who was in the photography department, a professor, who took me to go and buy my first camera, which was a little tiny Olympus, which was really tiny at the time, that all of a sudden cameras started getting smaller. And I took a class from Alan Sekula, about black room and art photography. So I forgot, what was the question?
It's about now that you're ill.
Oh, no. So my people, it's sort of like if I want to be seen as in my photography, so part of that is just sort of beginning to come up with funding to have somebody help me do not only my archive, but to get like my photography out. And even the Los Siete work is, people did not know that I had done that. And it was, the Los Siete work, which I like a lot, it's not that whole, like, you know, with women with their mouths open. To me, I found that sort of more like a trope from photography with the women with a open mouth.
But you also have all of those, the Las Santas, a woman's cart club, you know, young cholas. They're really
there are several series
They're so
of
bad.
work
They're really great.
That still have yet to see the light of day, which I would love to do. And that's my interest right now. And can I say something really bad?
You can go ahead and say anything you want.
I was nominated about 2 years ago to be part of something, or I never heard of it. Anonymous Was a Woman. And it's where somebody, like the McCarthy thing, nominates you for, in this whole group of women who are like older women, and I think past 50. So I was nominated for that, and I didn't get it. So in fact, the person that did get, who was a Latina, because they could only hire one, no matter how many people they have. There's only one
Always
Latina
one.
at a time.
Always one.
No matter, it might be 4 or 5 or 6 other, you know, especially white women. But it, you know, it's anyhow. So, and then I was nominated again for the second go round, and I. Again, did not qualify for that, because I was counting on that to really help me perhaps get my archives done. So it's
So those of you that are out there in, you know, in the noosphere of streamlining, we know how to reach Yolanda if you would like to make a contribution to this project.
anyhow. So that's really my right now is, especially since our building as an old 4-unit building was put under eviction because the owner wanted to, especially 3 years ago, just wanted to make as much money as they could, you know, and he had already owned like 50 or 60 properties in San Francisco, so he just wanted to divest himself of this right in the Mission, old Victorian. And we fought it. And in fact, my neighbors fought it. Renee Yanez, who was probably took part of that leadership. And so we were no longer, a local organization bought our building, and so we could stay. But we had to move from upstairs to downstairs because they had to renovate the apartments that we were in so they could make more money. You know, what do they call it? A room as a standard, whatever, rent was, you know, which is a higher, that they could supplement us that were still kept at a lower pace.
But it was an example, and a fairly current example of still how the Mission is still an organizing base. I mean, it was an anti-gentrification battle that was won through community support.
Yeah,
I
absolutely,
mean, it's just, that's
absolutely.
pretty great. And
So
Renee and you were
yeah,
the
whatever,
key
but
people of it, so.
and my son too. He was
yes,
out there too.
yes,
My son Rio
absolutely.
Yanez.
We have another
One more
last
question. Talking about your son.
Yes.
Okay, I'm Eileen Boris from Feminist Studies here. And I wanted to know about the impact of motherhood on your art.
Oh,
It had
God.
an impact.
It's one of the greatest joys I ever had, and also the hardest work I ever did. Both at the same time, and since I had no real extended family support group, I read Dr. Spock and read Penelope, I think Penelope Houston, who's British. So I read a lot of books. Go ahead, and the development. I was like, oh, my son must be reading this book. He's following the whole developmental. But it is quite wonderful, and it's quite different now. He just turned 40, and our relationship is quite different, and it's another struggle, you know. What can I say? It's still it's more negotiation, since I'm no longer in charge in dealing with him as an adult and as an artist and as a curator. So, but it's been like I said, the hardest work I've ever done, but also the most joyful, and really.
So when
truly,
you say it's the
really,
hardest,
truly,
when you say it's the hardest, right? I think that. Well, we're mothers of sons here. but I mean, I think that the joy, obviously, is just the greatest
Unbounded.
love. Yeah, it's
Unbounded.
you know, and the generosity that one feels.
Yeah.
Those are just beauteous, and I
Yeah.
know you have that with your son.
Yes.
He's a beautiful young man. But when you say it's hard, the hard work, give us a little of the hard work. You know, just like
the hard part was several years I was, especially when he was in high school, and working 2 different universities in Oakland and Berkeley, CCAC and at UC Berkeley at the art practice, but also teaching out of Mount Zion Hospital. There was a group called Art with Elders, so I had appointments each week with several people where I would teach the homebound elderly. It was a wonderful program. But also racing back, I had a little Honda racing back to pick him up from high school, bring him back home because high school was over near the ocean. And we were so it was all that. And making sure that he had food, making sure he had clean clothes. At one point, I was not hired to do academic work, and I ended up applying for the census, 2000
I remember
census.
that when you did the
And
census.
it was quite interesting. I was hired as a recruitment manager, and standing in the rain at a bus, trying to get home to him, and realizing that he was also standing, and I he only had a sweatshirt, a zip-up sweatshirt, standing in the rain. I said, "Oh my God," he's standing there getting soaked, you know. And the frustration of not being able to provide him with a. I said, once I get my first check from this place, we're going to go up and buy him. He can buy whatever jacket he wants. So it's things like that, you know, that are hard, and children don't understand why you're not there.
Yes,
you know,
yes. Particularly as an artist, and
oh,
we
yeah.
talk about
That's all. That's
Yeah.
right. I was being part of various shows and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's when I went into installation, because I didn't have the intensive time to do paintings and drawings. So what I did was installation. I could gather, you know, here and there, and had ideas. Right now, I do have an installation up at the University of San Francisco called The Nanny, which is about, it was done in 1994, right in the, because my son was born in 1980, so he was about 14. But anyhow, hard to describe now, but anyhow, you can go to their website. But
So
it was psychologically, and it was lonely. I couldn't buy clothes anymore, so most of my clothes at the time were Costco, what I call Costco clothes. So, and since I grew up with a bunch of tailors and seamstresses, I knew that men's clothing were much better, which indeed they are, better constructed at the same price as women's clothes, and women's clothes are sometimes more expensive. So I wore a lot of like men's pants and T-shirts, you know, just sort of provisional. Acceptable, you know, not pretending to be a man or otherwise, but, you know, and looking fresh, you know, but had no clothing, really. So, I keep wanting to
that's
hang.
okay. Well, anyway, so I think that we're probably going to rejoin then over at Las Maestras Center, and Yolanda, just thank you. I mean,
thank you.
We really, we can all give her an
Thank
applause.
you. Thank you.
So you wanna say
Thank you very
anything?
much. Too. Appreciate you being here.
I just want to thank you, Yolanda. I want to cry.
Oh dear, don't make me cry, Celia.
And I was just having a moment myself. You know, I was thinking about Cherríe and I were able to be in Germany not long ago, and I said I have to go see Kathy Kolwitz's work. You know, so we went to her museum, and I walked in and I started crying because I thought these were the first images that told me that I could make the work that I make. So I want to thank you for that, you know, for stepping out of line like that and opening up that road, you know, for all of us, you know, that we're looking for, you know, that path. And I also want to say before I go, one really political thing, which was, you know, you should have been teaching long ago as a professor. And it's a statement when you ask that question about, you know, the art departments at the UC system and the state system. I used to tell my students that there's a policy at the UC system that there could only be one Latino Chicano artist per 1,000-mile radius. So if you have one in, you know, graphic design, you are not going to have one in art history. And if you have one in art history, you're not going to have one in art practice, or 3 or 4 or 5. You know, so the fact that that you didn't know about graduate school and how it functioned, 10 years later, you know, I didn't either. 20 years later, there are folks that don't know either. That getting into the department, being able to teach, besides the initial movement, which young people pushed to have representation in art departments, there has never been a follow-up. Those folks went through the steps, retired, the positions collapsed behind them. So we are still in probably the same straits, if not worse now, if you do a study on the UC system and Latino Chicano artists who have this notion of a political cultural agenda, who see themselves as part and representation of a, you know, of community and society. You know, that's very rare to this day. Art historians, you know, curators, you name it, and we're still bereft.
I understand what you're saying.
So Yolanda, you know, it is, you know, an amazing thing to try and make work, you know, and continue to make work, continue to think and be dedicated. Because on top of that, for some reason, our generation felt like we shouldn't earn money, like it was bad. You know, property was bad, money was bad. You know, our work should be given away for free. There's still that idea of people who think that our work should be given, like we don't work. We should
Yeah.
just, it's a gift to the
quite
community.
true.
And no one asks, you know, how the rent gets paid, how the child goes to school, how the clothing gets on your back. That politic, I think, and I would say that, you know, you have never been a victim, you know, and so I honor you for that. I thank you for that, because of the attitude that it takes for us to continue to make work, you know, is the attitude that you've shown us. Yeah. So thank you.
My family too. Yeah. Gracias very
Well,
much. Thank
that
you,
is-
Cherríe. Thank you, Celia, and thank you for coming and for your interest. Gracias.
Muy bien. Gracias. Thank you. We'll see you over there.
Yeah. South Hall, 1415, if you haven't been to
1415
South Hall, 1415.